Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out on a very early, 8:30 or so, 8:40 on a rainy Monday morning in Washington, D.C. I know that others will be filing in. They'll try to be very quiet. There's a very heavy traffic out there, and it's raining, so we'll be asking our colleagues to be quiet when they come in. But I want to thank all of you here in D.C. for coming, and for the many, many that are online. Thank you for being here today. Today is the Wilson Center's third program in what we've been calling the Month of the Arctic. We have 6 or 7 programs covering a wide array of issues related to the Arctic. And we do that purposely because the Arctic isn't just about one or two things. It's now been integrated into the global discussion about all things economic, social, political, environmental. So our Month of the Arctic is from May 29th until June 29th with a number of programs. We're very, very happy today to bring to you this program entitled Space Technology for a Smart and Resilient Arctic. All sorts of facets related to this issue have come up in forums throughout the world, and we're very happy that we're able to host one here in Washington, D.C., with our colleagues from the Norwegian Embassy and Arctic Frontiers. We'll talk about that relationship in just a little bit. But right now, I'd like to introduce to the podium to set context and the foundation for today's work the Ambassador of Norway to the United States, Mr. Kari Aus. Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Mike, and it's good to be here. It's always good to be at the Wilson Center, and it's particularly good to be at the Wilson Center when we are discussing Arctic issues. And I really want to commend the Wilson Center for what you have achieved in a short period of time. And I also just hear that have an Arctic Polar Institute at the Wilson Center, and I want to really to congratulate you with that and commend you, as I said, for what you have been doing. And it's also a pleasure to be here together with Arctic Frontiers. Arctic Frontiers becoming a bigger international event, and I also want to applaud you what you have achieved in these during these years. Ladies and gentlemen, many people, they picture Arctic as an empty white space with polar bears. None of you here do that, but many do. As today's seminar will show, the Arctic is actually a high-tech corner of the Earth. Looking at the map, it is clear why the Arctic is a key foreign policy priority for my country. Norway's economic, political, and strategic interests, they come together in the north. As I have said many times, in Norway, nearly 10% of our population lives north of the Arctic Circle. 80% of our oceans, 30% of our land masses areas, they are also north of the Arctic Circle. We have universities, infrastructure, like harbors, cutting-edge research, and innovative businesses. Today, we are here to focus on Norwegian-American cooperation on space-based technology, satellites, and telecommunications. The importance of satellite technology in the Arctic cannot be overstated. It helps us better understand climate change, get more precise weather forecasts, navigate safely, and monitor the environment. Norway is a world leader in this field. This would not have been the case without the long-standing Norwegian-American cooperation on space technology. Our cooperation was initiated 50 years ago, when our two nations signed the framework agreement for peaceful cooperation in space between the US and Norway. This laid the foundation for what has become an excellent cooperation between our two countries. Rune Sandbakken from the Norwegian Space Center and Rolf Skattebo from COSAT will tell you about this in more detail later, but I would like to give you a few examples. Together, in 1997, United States and Norway developed the first antenna installation on Svalbard, the Norwegian archipelago on 78 degrees north. Here, at the top of the world, conditions are optimal for downloading data from satellites in polar orbit. Today, the station on Svalbard has become the world's largest ground station for downloading data from polar orbit satellites. And you have this nice picture behind me. So look on that and take a trip to Svalbard and see it by yourself. The Norwegian stations in the Arctic and Antarctica are supporting both NOAA weather satellites as well as NASA climate monitoring satellites. When hurricanes approach the US, data from Svalbard provides input to the US hurricane warnings. In this situation, time is of essence, as we know. The fiber optics cable between Svalbard and the mainland of Norway was developed by Norway and the US so that large amount of data from the satellite station can be transferred quickly. The hurricane example shows how Arctic connectivity benefits people living elsewhere on the globe. Obviously, improved telecommunications also is a vital part of building a smart and sustainable Arctic for the people living in the region. Connecting people in the Arctic with each other and with the rest of the world is essential as we move forward. Today, many parts of the Arctic have much less dependable and affordable telecommunications than we do in the Norwegian Arctic. Better access to the internet will, for instance, allow them to get better education and healthcare. We are building a smart and dynamic Arctic using the opportunities technology offers so that we can create sustainable and innovative businesses in the north. I'm very happy to see such good representation from Norway and the US businesses here today, and more people will come, as we heard from Mark, when the traffic is getting smoother out there. As the ice melts, we will see increased activity in the region. As Arctic coastal states, both Norway and the US have responsibility for exercising authority and providing monitoring and emergency preparedness in our vast sea areas. Better connectivity is fundamental for safer marine transportation, better search and rescue capacities, and improved oil spill preparedness. It is also essential for monitoring our national resources so that we can harvest them responsibly. The Arctic partnership between Norway and the United States is strong. We feel especially close to our fellow Northerners in Alaska, and I'm so pleased that my good friend, Senator Murkowski, will join the seminar later today. From each of our vantage points near the Arctic Circle, we share the same outlook and the same vision. I just came back from visiting Alaska, and as always, I was struck by how much we have in common. I'm also happy that we have Eirik Sivertsen, Chair of the Standing Committee of Parliamentarians in the Arctic, with us from Norway. Eirik, it's good to see you. I also want to thank the Wilson Center, and as I said initially, and the Arctic Frontiers for bringing us together this morning. Your cooperation in itself contributes to stronger interconnectedness in the Arctic and between our two countries. I hope the discussions will show how Norway and the US are working together to connect the Arctic today and how we can do even more going forward. I'm wishing you a great seminar, and thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for taking time this morning, and now he's rushing off to catch a flight. So thank you for taking time and setting the right context, the correct context for today's discussion. I'd like to invite my colleague, Mr. Ulo Uvretveit. I tried so hard with that last name, but with a last name like Sfregel, you'll forgive me for, yeah, okay.
It was very good.
It was, I tried, yeah. Ulla and I, along with Goril, spoke last year about bringing together the Wilson Center and Arctic Frontiers here, not just to the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., but working collaboratively in Norway and perhaps elsewhere around the world. It's best when Arctic thinkers think together and work together. And we at the Wilson Center, our philosophy has been to team up with good partners to keep elevating the narrative about the Arctic and bringing forward the important Arctic issues of the day, not just in nations' capitals, but other cities and other parts of the globe. So it's wonderful to have a partner like Arctic Frontiers. So would you please welcome my colleague.
Thank you very much, Mike, and good morning. I must also say that we are also very pleased with this collaboration today, and I would like to thank the Woodrow Wilson Center and the Norwegian embassy for this collaboration, which I hope and believe will be developed further in the years to come. So, as Mike said, my name is Ole Øvretveit, and I'm the director of the Arctic Frontiers Conference. It's an international arena on sustainable and knowledge-based development in the Arctic. In addition to various activities at home and abroad throughout the year, our main event is a conference 1 week in Tromsø, where we are welcoming some 3,500 delegates from 35 countries to discuss new challenges and possibilities in the north. Our brand is based on a comprehensive approach, bringing academia, government, and business together to create a firmer foundation for decision-making and sustainable economic development in the Arctic. And this also reflects today's program, which we are very proud of. We are also most proud of having brought strong Norwegian speakers with us to Washington. Coming from Tromsø, we are lucky as we live in the part of the Arctic which is truly connected. Although it's far north, for most practical reasons, is a region like most others in Europe. Other parts of the Arctic is not so connected yet. But the North has a fortunate location for us as far as communication goes, in bringing satellite data down, and located between 3 continents is also a potential global fiber cable hub. Developing these potentials will bring societal connectedness to the Arctic region, but also business opportunities. These issues are high on the Arctic Frontiers agenda, and the title of this year's conference was Connecting the Arctic, and the 2019 conference will be called Smart Arctic, and I would like to welcome you all to join us in Tromsø in January 2019. The image that people have of the Arctic is multifaceted, as the ambassador mentioned. It might be of ice, of remote communities, of ocean, more ice, polar bears, climate change, resources, and more ice again. Now, these are all concepts which exist in the Arctic, and this is important, and they are all important, but they do not constitute the region alone. There are also thriving, modern, technologically advanced, knowledge-based, connected, smart societies in the north, and which I hope we will prove here today, also with smart people. Developing and sharing new smart solutions for and within the circumpolar area is in itself smart, so we should do more of that. We travel a lot and discuss the Arctic all over the world, and my impression is that the willingness to protect the Arctic and prevent development seems to be reversed proportional with the distance to the region. And I think that by focusing on these issues in an Arctic context and using these terms, connectivity, technology, smart societies, it might also contribute to changing the narrative and the perception of the Arctic, replacing it with a more balanced and realistic image, in turn giving a better foundation for decisions and policies concerning the region. Norway and the US are both Arctic countries. A good dialogue between us is very important. That's why we had a seminar in Anchorage a month ago with the Northern Institute and other friends. That's why we have a close relationship with the Arctic Encounter organization. That's why I'm going to Boston tomorrow to discuss these issues with friends at Tufts University, and that is why we are here today. And I must say that the collaboration between the Wilson Center and Arctic Frontiers is one that I really hope will develop and deepen in the months and years to come, as I mentioned. Although our 2 organizations hardly may be compared in size, we share the same broad approach on the Arctic. And as we discussed yesterday, Mike, I think we share the same ambition to let results and impact of what we do guide our collaboration instead of protection of turf and competition. So, moving to today's program, the first session is called The Role of Satellite Technologies in the Arctic, and it's a privilege for me to introduce the session's moderator, Director of Alaska Satellite Facility at the University of Alaska, Fairbanks, Dr. Nettie LaBelle-Hammer. Please. And thank you very much.
Would also ask the panelists to please come forward. Thank you.
Good morning. It is indeed a pleasure and an honor to be here. I thank Mike Sfraga for putting this together and inviting me to come here. I have a very esteemed group of colleagues here with me that I will be introducing as we move forward. I did want to say a few words introducing myself and who I am and why I am sitting here moderating this group today before I get into the rest of the session. So, well, while we wait for that, let me just say I'd like to thank everybody for coming. We have Dr. Michael Byers here from the University of British Columbia. We have Mr. Sean Helfrich here from NOAA, from STAR. We've known each other for a long time. And I'd also like to welcome my friends from Norway, Rolf Skattebo and Rune Sandebakken. Thank you very much for joining us. Okay, well, as a lifelong Alaskan, I can tell you that I've learned to deal with things as they get served up. So no PowerPoints today, it serves me right. I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about the University of Alaska Fairbanks Geophysical Institute and the Alaska Satellite Facility, and why it is that a small university in the middle of Alaska is part of this international cooperation. So the Geophysical Institute was actually founded in 1946 by an act of Congress. That's kind of an unusual event for a research institute. But there were problems with communications in the Arctic due to the active aurora that happened up there, and we wanted to figure out why. And that's really the heart of how we started at the Geophysical Institute. We actually have now 7 different discipline groups and over 350 people who are working at the Geophysical Institute, primarily on Arctic science. In the late 80s, there was a science project that was proposed to NASA to get access to synthetic aperture radar data for the scientists who were studying the Arctic. This little research group was called the Alaska SAR facility, and there was 1 antenna and 10 minutes of satellite data a day that was proposed. In 1991, we started that organization. We now have 3 NASA antennas. We're building 2 more. We have 2 university-owned antennas, and we have a data center with somewhere between 5 and 6 petabytes of data. So we grew from a great idea and a couple of scientists into a facility with 55 staff working to downlink data for scientific purposes primarily, and create data products for Arctic science and to serving both the U.S. and our international communities. So I'd like to go ahead and see if we can get, Dr. Myers, you don't have slides today. You are a lucky man, because that's going to work out for you. Dr. Meyer holds the chair of the Canadian Research in Global Politics and International Law at the University of British Columbia, and I welcome you here this morning.
Thank you. It's very good to be here. I was pleased to discover last night that the Canadian border is still open. I want to start by referencing the fact that the person in the office of the legal advisor in the U.S. State Department, who is in charge of Arctic legal issues, is also responsible for space legal issues. And I am told by the previous occupant of that position that this is called the post for cold, dark, and dangerous places. And I tell that anecdote to point out that there's an awful lot of similarity between the Arctic and outer space. And I want to begin my talk by putting forward a hypothesis that cold, dark, dangerous, faraway places demand cutting-edge technologies and international cooperation. Now, technology in the Arctic has been around as long as people have been in the Arctic. The Inuit, the indigenous people, of Canada, Alaska, Greenland, built comfortable homes out of snow, built boats without wood, were able to travel across the sea ice on dog sled several hundred miles a day. A high technology society within the context of a very extreme environment. And technology has continued to advance in the Arctic in all kinds of ways. My country, Canada, became the third country in space in 1972 with the launch of Anik-1, the first domestic communication satellite, civilian satellite, because the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation needed to be able to transmit to Canadians from coast to coast to coast. Communications back in 1972, driving a relatively modest country to become the third space power because of the Arctic. And it goes on from there. Again, we've already heard mention of synthetic aperture radar. This technology was developed in the Soviet Union and in the United States, but it was Canada who commercialized it with RadarSat-1 because of its enormous applications in a region which is in complete darkness for months each year, where optical satellites cannot provide remote sensing, and synthetic radar, aperture radar could. And I've been a beneficiary of this, sailing through the Northwest Passage on icebreakers using RadarSat imagery every single day to determine where the ice was and where it was not, because the job of an icebreaker is actually to avoid ice wherever possible. So technology driving the Arctic. And in terms of international cooperation, we've seen that also. In 1973, countries came together to protect the polar bear from extinction. The polar bear was threatened by the advent of the helicopter and the use of the helicopter to hunt the bears from the air. The global population of polar bears was cut in half by the introduction of the helicopter. And at the height of the Cold War, the Arctic countries came together and banned the use of aircraft and icebreakers for the hunting of polar bears, and the population recovered. We've been cooperating in the Arctic for an awfully long time as well. And of course, we've been doing the same thing in space. Space is a high technology frontier. That is obvious. But it's also a frontier where we've been cooperating with other countries, including during the Cold War. In 1975, the Apollo-Soyuz project, the famous handshake in space, was an important part of détente. It was a reaching across the divide between the two countries in a cold, dark, dangerous region. The International Space Station was created in large part to create cooperation with Russia and to keep Russian space scientists employed so they wouldn't go and work for North Korea or Pakistan. We've been doing this really well for a long, long time. And this continues to advance in all kinds of really important ways. So today, satellite search and rescue beacons are ubiquitous in the Arctic. Inuit hunters can borrow them from the local Royal Canadian Mounted Police station every time they go out in the land. Adventurers, tourists, you've got your SAR beacon. Ships have to carry them under International Maritime Organization rules. Airplanes have to carry them, right? It takes the search out of search and rescue in a remote region where minutes can mean saving a life. Saving minutes, saving hours can mean saving a life. And if you eliminate the search and you have a direct connection, a direct location, many, many thousands of lives can actually be saved over the years. That cooperation dates back to 1979. Cosmos SARSAT was a partnership between the United States, the European Space Agency, Canada, and the Soviet Union, using initially Soviet satellites to receive signals from North American beacons, transmitted back to search and rescue centers in North America and around the world. And this continues today in a huge way. Again, they're now ubiquitous, and they save thousands of lives. And as a result, countries like Canada and the United States save tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in search costs each year because of space technology. And then coming back to remote sensing, I had the great pleasure of visiting the ground station in Svalbard. This is a misleading photograph. It's taken during the summertime, but remember that this is a cold, dark, dangerous place where there is no sunlight for many months each year. But this is a phenomenal facility, and it's taking advantage of the fact that polar orbits converge near the North and South Pole. So the further north or south you go with the ground station, the more utility it can provide. And this partnership between KSAT and governments and companies around the world is absolutely groundbreaking. But the exciting part that I want to close on here is that KSAT is now moving into Canada, or at least trying to, because on the opposite side of the pole at Inuvik in the Northwest Territories, we now have a fiber optic cable that connects Inuvik, which is located north of the Arctic Circle, with southern Canada. And we built that in large part because we wanted to help companies like KSAT. And now we're in a situation where we're discovering that this technology is moving so quickly, the information is out of date. And KSAT is now struggling to get licenses out of a bureaucracy that is saddled with obsolete legislation. And that's okay, because we're moving forward and finding ways to cooperate. The final thing I want to say on all this is that we also need to think seriously about how we invest in space for Arctic purposes, again, because technology moves so quickly. 3 years ago, the Canadian government was planning on spending several $1 billion on a couple of communication satellites that were going to be put in polar orbit to provide broadband communications for both military and civilian purposes in the Canadian Arctic. They've pulled back from that plan. And I initially thought that was a very bad thing, because we need broadband connectivity in the Arctic. But I now think it was a prescient thing, because there are commercial operators who are going to be able to provide the service far cheaper than any government could. Starlink, which is SpaceX, which is Elon Musk's company, has a license now from I think it's the FCC here in the United States, to launch more than 4,000 satellites into low Earth orbit to provide 5G coverage worldwide. That might take 5, 7, 10 years, but it's still going to be faster than the Canadian government multi-billion-dollar initiative for 2 satellites. And OneWeb, another American company, which is supported financially by Japan's SoftBank, plans to do something very similar. So all of a sudden, governments are having to adjust as corporate actors come in with new technology, cheap technology, constellations that can provide complete coverage at far lower cost. So my final sort of message here is that space and the Arctic are connected. We have a 3-dimensional Arctic, but it's actually more than that. It's a 4-dimensional Arctic, because it used to be mostly governments, and now it's companies like KSAT, which is partly owned by the Norwegian government, and entirely private companies like SpaceX, which are now redefining the field. And this is all very, very exciting, but it also means that we can't get stuck in old ways of thinking. That some of these new opportunities provided by these new private actors are opening up fields and chances for technological advancement that we could have only dreamed of just a couple of years ago. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your comments. I really like bringing up the concept that science is driving the technology, and then the technology then drives the policy. So we are constantly pushing forward and in those collaborations. And I'm going to take your discussion of collaboration, and I'm going to add to it that the International Ice Charting Working Group had been working for many years to bring ice charting together. And the National Ice Service in the United States and the Canadian Ice Center in Canada have worked together and created the North American Ice Service. And that is just one small example of the collaboration. And we've all benefited from the RadarSat legacy. So I personally thank you very much for that. And this is a nice segue. Sean is here from NOAA. And he's now in the STAR program, but he came from the National Ice Center. Sean?
Sure. So I'm going to just cover the role of NOAA's satellites in the Arctic. And I'd like to look at in 3 different mission goals. One is really to be able to make sure that we have real-time data coming in to be able to provide for forecasts. This is forecasts for oceans as well as for weather forecasts as well as for ecological forecasts as well. And this way they, another thing to be able to think about as far as a mission is the idea that what really happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic. So if we are to make sure that we're providing good forecasts to the lower 48 states, you have to be able to turn around and have good observations coming all over the world, and the Arctic plays a big role in that, particularly in winter weather forecasting. And lastly, of course, since we've been taking observations for such a long time period at this point, you can actually start studying and monitoring change over time. And that's another one of the things that NOAA does in its mission goals. Actually, I guess I need the pointer in order to change the slides.
Changer. Yeah.
To the right.
Is that
No, to the right. There we go. So, NOAA has 4 satellites. They're new observational platforms. The first is that was launched in 2012 is the Suomi NPP satellite. It is a polar orbiter, but it's really pushed the limits for NOAA at least in the types of observations that we can wind up taking. It's provided us with whole new capacities, much of which we're just starting to be able to roll out the type of algorithms that we need to be able to monitor the Arctic at this point. And it also is part of the JPSS program, which has very similar instrumentation package to the Suomi NPP. So we now have 2 satellites actually, polar orbiters that we can leverage for taking all kinds of observations. And then there's the GOES 16 and 17 satellites, which are geostationary. What's really unique about this newer versions of the GOES instruments, not only the high resolution that maybe some of the people have noticed on your local weather forecasts, but it actually has fairly decent resolution even at high latitudes. So you can actually start to be able to monitor sea ice or weather observations all the way far up into Hudson Bay and as far north as areas in the Bering Sea. So suddenly we have a whole new suite of high temporal or frequent observations that we can start to leverage. And lastly, non-NOAA satellites, which NOAA, through its many partnerships, leverages NASA satellites, JAXA satellites, RadarSat-2, ESA satellites, and we couldn't really complete our global mission if we did not have all these partnerships, because NOAA has, while it's maintaining its eye on the U.S. national areas, once again, if you don't have a global coverage, you can't really monitor things correctly. So this is just an example of some of the types of new capacities that are out there just due to a couple of the satellites. And it's through a lot of the implementation of these new algorithms that suddenly we are getting a new understanding of in the front top center, you're seeing global or sea ice concentrations in the Arctic that are from optical instruments. This is a whole new understanding at high resolution for ice concentrations that will provide better understanding along the sea ice edge. And certainly things like RadarSat constellation going into the future, as well as the ESA or Copernicus program for Sentinel, has provided a whole new availability of SAR imagery that was never available before. And this is making it where the exploitation of this data has become readily available is helping to be able to improve our understanding of what's going on at the high latitudes. Once again, if we took this into a longer time frame, the new technologies are wonderful at being able to provide that weather scale, but if we actually start looking at climate scale observations, the new technology has to be intercompatible with what we understood what was happening in the past. And it's through those understandings of the changes that we can exploit the new technology in the best way. In other words, if you didn't understand that air temperatures are or you're trying to be able to monitor air temperatures, but you don't understand how air temperatures are changing or have changed through time, you can exploit and know how these changes might impact communities as well as the economies at the high latitudes. Certainly, air temperatures have been noted for their changes. This is the area, the Arctic, where we've seen the most changes occurring. It's nearly double the amount of warming as has been seen even at the lower latitudes. Where the air temperature has changed, it's also impacted and has feedbacks on other areas of the climate system, or I should say the Earth system. Most notably, sea ice and snow. The sea ice has become seen a quicker retreat, taking much longer to be able to freeze up in the Western Arctic, and this has had pretty big implications on the global coverage of sea ice. And that particular area to the north in the Beaufort and Chukchi Sea has been one of those areas that we've seen the most change. It's not only a change in the overall extent, but in the sea ice thickness as well. So since 2000, or since more recent understandings, if we take it back to where the ice thickness was, nearly back in 1985, we've seen a 45% decrease in the overall thickness and ice volume. That's pretty alarming when we actually look at the implications that we'll wind up having. And then the snow cover is also on which is probably less making headlines than the sea ice, but the snow cover has also been decreasing at a pretty quick rate. And it's not been much of a change in the wintertime overall extent. That's stayed relatively the same. But when it comes to springtime, that snow melt is occurring much quicker than before. Greenland ice sheets, they're also we've noticed a volume loss within the Greenland ice sheets. As noted here, there's been a close to, and this is a twofold effect. Some, it's just overall calving that's occurring at the edge where the ice is breaking off into icebergs into the, particularly the Greenland Sea and the Baffin Bay, but also areas of overall melt that's occurring through top melt that creates glacial lakes, drains down to the bottom and continues to be able to flush itself out, which actually is helping to speed up that entire process of calving. And this is a contributor to sea level rise. So another thing that through satellite observations we wouldn't be able to do if we didn't have a good understanding of satellites, or how to apply the satellites in order to monitor the Greenland ice sheets. And we have new technologies on the way with ICESat-2 from NASA that should provide even improved estimates. And those are just a couple of the things that are changing, but I put a couple of things that are, once again, making less headlines. As that sea ice winds up changing, you get in the Western Arctic, it provides opportunities for increased warming of the sea surface temperatures in that same location. That's been noted, once again, through satellite observations. As you get warmer waters as well as less ice cover, the amount of algal production as well as plankton production has been noted as well within those same areas. So you have an ecological change that's occurring. As that snow cover has changed, they've noticed that the green up is occurring, at least in Alaska, at the northern slope of Alaska at a much quicker rate. That once again has ecological implications and changes the albedo in that area as well. Lastly, that it can also impact wildfires as that snow cover and drying winds up occurring at a quicker rate. It certainly makes areas more prone to wildfires, which has been once again noted in Alaska. It's only through the use of all these technologies that we've been able to monitor the polar regions the way we are. But there's certainly a lot of holes within our knowledge. While the technologies that are out there are are helping to be able to improve our understanding. There's certainly as many unknowns about it as we have knowns. It's particularly from NOAA's side, we wind up having it where we have one suite of satellites that are meant to be able to do one central focus on the mission. But unless we're able to leverage all those other technologies from our partnering nations and partnering space agencies, as well as domestic and international, are we really going to get leverage all those technologies so that we can operate in the Arctic and provide resilient communities with the information that they need in the Arctic? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So one of the things that I would like to highlight from your discussion in both the science and the technology is that there's really two different timescales that we're looking at that are very important to technologies and to the science of the Arctic. One is the long-term observations. It's absolutely crucial for us to have these long-term, consistent, and interoperable observations over the long term for us to look at trends. But we also have the near real-time aspects of it that requires us to grow our technologies and grow our capabilities, both in space and on the ground. And while we at the Alaska Satellite Facility have been growing and expanding, Kongsberg has become a global company and a great value to this industry. So it is my pleasure to introduce Rolf Skattebo, who is the president of KSAT. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Nelly. Appreciate being here, ladies and gentlemen. And it's interesting what you just said there, how government and cooperation can spawn and evolve into something else. Because that's correctly noted, KSAT used to be government. We used to be the Norwegian Space Agency. But at about 15 years ago, we decided that, hey, let's see if we can really commercialize some of the activities that we are providing in the Arctic and with respect to satellite operations. So I was with the Space Agency at that time, so we first decided to commercialize, meaning that we took away all the government funding from what at that point was two government field centers, one in Tromsø, Norway, and one at Svalbard. And then a couple of years later, we decided to privatize it. And that cooperation has led to what you just heard Nettie said, and the ambassador also alluded to earlier this morning, to one of the largest commercial ventures on related to satellite operations. So that's a really interesting story that we can talk about. And being an international entity, we also do face some challenges. As we heard about Canada, we've been working for the last 2.5 years trying to get a license in Canada to expand the cooperation. But that is a different story. So what I'd like to do now, I'll show you a couple of the examples of the services that we are providing daily to the user communities around the world. And since Nettie didn't have any slides, I have probably too many. So I'll skip some of them as we go along, but my story can't really be told without imageries. So this one, you already heard of as well. It's nice to be on top and the bottom of the globe when you talk about, we talk to satellites. They converge on the top 14 times a day. And they like to be on the bottom as well. So if you have a station in the Arctic and one in Antarctica, as we do, you can have the most efficient system for data collection and dissemination. And as you may know, there are at least two leading entities working in the Arctic and in the Antarctica for satellite data receptions. It's the Alaska SAR facility and the NOAA facility in Fairbanks. And it's the KSAT facility in Svalbard, Norway. And on the other side, we have the American facilities at McMurdo in Antarctica and our stations in the Troll, which is on the opposite side in Antarctica. So the US and Norway has a unique way of creating the most efficient data collection network for polar orbiting, meteorology, and weather satellites around the globe. So when you are on the top, you can kind of cover this area. And as you can see, it covers most of the important regions that we do have here. So the station, something's happened there. This is the station at Svalbard as it looks today. And it has grown significantly since we first started in 1997 in a cooperative effort with NASA, as earlier mentioned. And the ones that are circled are now the antenna installations that are used to support American satellite systems. And NOAA, obviously, is a large user of the facility, and we're in the midst of a transition now from a NASA operation to a NOAA operation as JPSS, the new weather satellite system, goes really operational. So by August 1st, the legacy NASA contract is not a NASA contract anymore, it's a NOAA contract. But still, the data will be provided in the same timely manner as always before. In the Arctic, and this is a knowledge audience, so I won't talk too much about this, but we see the activity increasing all the time, and on the Norwegian sector, it's especially the oil and gas activity that's pushing the borders up north. Norway has opened the regions north of the northern part of Norway, which will be far north from the Alaska and Canadian northern shores for explorations activities. And that causes a lot of new challenges. First of all, you have to have a more efficient ice forecasting and monitoring. There will be drifting ice. There will be severe polar low pressure systems on the weather side, so you need to have a more active focus on that. And in addition, tourism is moving north. As I show you example later, the Norwegian cruise ships are expanding their activity up north. So combined with increased fisheries and increased general activity, satellite monitoring in that region has to be improved. I'll skip a couple of these. So if we don't have satellites and the right type of satellites, this is what you see.
Yeah. Yes.
You see nothing. It's pitch dark. It happens that we have 24-hour sunlight in the summertime, but most of the time in the winter, this is what you will see. And that's why you need to use technology to solve that situation. And the radar satellites are the only one that can really do the job for you. And Norway has decided over the last couple of years to put a special emphasis on marine situational awareness in the northern regions using data from polar orbiting radar satellites. It's not a new technology, but it's a technology that is evolving. And the satellites used to be like the one behind me. This is the Sentinel satellite, I think the one I pulled out. It is the size of a bus, and it costs about $1 billion. And it takes more than 15 years to develop and launch. And that's kind of nice if you are a rich government, but it's not really nice if you're a small or a company or an institution that like to have a rapid, ongoing, continuous monitoring. Then you have to think differently. And right now there is a number of initiatives going on, and I'm going to use this one for a Finnish initiative called ISI that rethought the entire concept of cooperation, for observation in the north. And they designed a small satellite, and it's producing really good data. And Norway is now in the middle of doing the same, and you'll hear a little bit more about that later. So there is a technology changing trend in this region as well to make sure that we get what we need, and that's the more continuous operation of data collection systems in that region. So to illustrate to those of you that really don't know how this can be used, I'll give you 3 or 4 examples sort of in this end of my presentation. This is called the Hurtigruten case. This is a coastal steamer. It normally goes along the coast of Norway, one ship at one port every day, and it takes about 2 weeks. But they have realized that there is an area for tourism as well. And when they take those ships and they want to go, for example, from Norway up north, satellite information like the ones you see here is totally necessary for the operations. In this image, we have combined a number of different inputs. It's a satellite imagery. You have Norway on the bottom part of that picture, and then you have the archipelago of Svalbard in the middle, and then you have the ice. So combination of the ice, the water, the satellite imagery tells the captain who sits actually down on the southern part of Norway, northern part of Norway, deciding where to go. And if you add a little bit more information like the winds, you can help him avoid all the polar low pressure systems that comes off the ice. You see the arrows that go in a straight direction, and he will plan his route in a much more efficient way. And satellites aren't, without satellites this wouldn't be possible. Another example is the Quintilian case, where there was a fiber optic cable being laid across the northern shore of Alaska. And I personally think this is a really good example of international cooperation, because it was an American project with American contractors and European contractors. And we were actually subcontracting to a French company supporting this one, and using all kinds of information to decide how they could lay the cable in the most efficient way for that project. And again, I won't go into details on the different things in this one, but it's basically the same story. You need satellite information combined with other technology to get a real situational awareness picture of a given area at a given point in time. The ambassador also mentioned meteorology, and this picture of the hurricane hitting, unfortunately, Florida again, was collected at Svalbard. And when the Svalbard station collects the data, they send the data immediately to Suitland, Maryland, and it goes into the weather forecast together with the National Hurricane Center down wherever it is. I don't really remember. But anyways, polar regions has a global impact as well, because most of the weather converges up north and then it's spread out throughout the southern areas. I'm not a meteorologist, so they will probably argue me on that one, but in broad terms, that's what happens. We have in Norway used satellite technology for more than 25 years to also detect oil spill. And radars, again, are really good tools to see changes on the sea surface. And as you may see, it's hard to see here, but this is basically a dark dot in the middle of a gray picture. And that dark dot is an oil slick that was detected at Svalbard, reported to the European Maritime Safety Agency in Lisbon, and then verified with a US plane, and a UK plane that ran out and detected that. And in this case, a Russian tanker has lost the hose in the water. So instead of refueling another ship, it threw all the oil out in the water. And towards the end here, there are a couple of other examples. And in Norway, it's an increasing focus on the quest for illegal fishery. It's about $13 billion a year that is lost in illegal fishery. And illegal fishery is really bad for everyone, because first of all, somebody steals the fish. The guys that were supposed to fish the fish can't fish the fish because somebody stole it. And the guys that can't fish the fish because somebody took their fish, they can't feed their populations, and they won't have any industry onshore to use the fish they should have fished. So Norway is now, I'm not joking, I just find it sort of like a negative Kinder egg. I mean, it goes down the drain if you don't focus on that. So Norway has actually started a focus initiative to deal with that. And satellites, again, has to be used. In this image, there are some green dots and some red dots. The green dots are identified ships. They're nice. You know who they are. Use different type of information and you find them. The red ones are unidentified, and you want to look closer to them. And in this particular case, we found them sitting in a small fjord up at Svalbard, grouping themselves together. And when we, at that day, it wasn't really dark, so it goes against what I just said about needing radar satellites, because that day was a nice day and it was summer, so we had a chance to call some other friends of ours that took this picture. And this picture shows two ships sitting next to one another in a desolated fjord up north, and probably, I won't speculate what they're doing because the Coast Guard is checking what they're doing. But it shows how important satellites are to provide situational maritime awareness. Finally, transportation in ice. I'll skip that fairly quickly because we talked about it. But my key point is that we cannot do what we have to do in the Arctic, either from commercial, from government sides, or even on touristic approach without a proper and quick access to reliable and good satellite information. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to try to do the tongue twister that you were able to do today. I appreciate that. I do want to point out that, again, the theme of continuous observations in the Arctic is a very important part of why we're here, what we've been working on, and how we've been working together. You did confuse me with the one slide that looked like a photo out of my front window at night in mid-January, but your point is well taken, that without satellites we see nothing. But without satellite communications, we hear nothing. So it's very much living in the Arctic is very dependent on these modern technologies. And we have Rune Sandebakken here from the satellite communications section of the Norwegian Space Center. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for allowing me to take part in this interesting session. Before I head into the role of satellite technologies, I want to start off with some statistics from Norway. If you picked up the leaflet outside this room about Norway's Arctic strategy, you would quickly find, as already been mentioned here, that the Arctic part of the Norwegian waters is really filled with waters and ice. Although that is the case, we also know that there is a growing interest in the Arctic being a place for tourists, as already been mentioned by Mr. Skattebo. And you would see the chart on the screen here indicating the number of port calls and the number of passengers at the Longyearbyen port all the way from 2000 to 2017. And it's not an aggregation of passengers and calls, it's actually numbers by each year. As you would see, over 17 years, there is an annual growth of approximately 15% per year, both in the number of ships, but also in the number of passengers that would actually find an interest in going into the Arctic on larger cruise ships or smaller boats calling the Longyearbyen port. To support this, we also have measurements actually from space, and this diagram here shows it's a shorter time frame. It's from 2011 up until 2016. You'd see maritime traffic recorded above 66 degrees north. You would see an annual variation. Winter, when it's relatively dark, as already been mentioned here. The activity level is of course reduced, but during the summer months, the activity level increase. And as you would see on the lower side of the graph here, there is an increase in the activity level both during wintertime but also during the summertime. So again, it illustrates that there is a growing interest in the Arctic also from people living outside of it. Arctic-related satellite technologies. Quite commonly, we divide satellite technologies in 3 different areas. It's already been mentioned, but I still want to mention it. We talk about satellite communications, we talk about Earth observations, we talk about navigation. And of course, me working with satellite communications on a daily basis, I would of course say that connectivity is the key. But speaking about Arctic-oriented technologies, we would have to limit ourselves to satellites that actually cover the Arctic. And non-geosynchronous systems, not speaking about geostationary satellites and such, non-geosynchronous systems is of course, they have an advantage when we are moving up north. So that could be systems like the coming SpaceX, coming OneWeb, and other systems. Turning over to Earth observations, it's of course an advantage to utilize satellites moving in low Earth orbits, and in particular if they also move in polar orbits, as already illustrated nicely by Mr. Skattebo in his presentation. For satellite navigation, all of the global navigation satellite systems would today cover the Arctic. So there would be some regional systems, like the Japanese one, that would not be ideal to cover the Arctic. But again, the larger systems, GPS, GLONASS, the coming Galileo system, they all cover the Arctic areas. Now, in addition to each of these technologies, the beauty really starts when you are trying to combine such systems or technologies. You would find applications, you would find services that gives you additional benefits from using each of these basic technologies. And I'll touch upon some of them in my presentation. Ice charts had already been mentioned, and this is automated by now by the Norwegian Met, and that means that you're able to collect and eventually distribute information about larger areas to a large number of users at a lower cost. But in order to transmit such information to the users, you would probably like to single out areas of interest. And this could be singled out by knowing a little bit more about the position of each users. And again, I'll turn to the next chart and show such an integrated situational awareness picture. It's basically the same example as Mr. Skattebo has mentioned. And in this case, you are actually combining all the three satellite technologies into one application. You are using Earth observation information, you tie it with the position of the user, and you transmit the information to the user, most probably via satellites. As has already been mentioned by Mr. Skattebo, we have historically seen a number of large satellites providing services, applications to users. But nowadays, with a new set of technology, it is quite possible to replace quite a few of such satellites with smaller satellites that can actually do quite a lot. And some of the satellites are shown on this screen right now. You will see 4 different small Norwegian satellites, ranging from the AES satellites on the top, weighing about 6 kilos each, to the slightly larger satellites at the bottom. That would be the NorSat 1 and 2 satellites launched last year, which in addition to AES payloads, capable of collecting AES data, anti-collision information from ships worldwide, they also contain other sensors on board. And the AES sensor on board, the NorSat satellites, is a Norwegian sensor developed by another Kongsberg company, Kongsberg Sitex in Trondheim. It weighs 1.2 kilos, and it's one of the most advanced AES receivers today. The coming NorSat satellite, which is under construction, is again the same size. It contains an AES receiver, but it also contains an enhancement. It's a navigation radar detector that will enhance the maritime surveillance. On board the NorSat 2, we also have an interesting demonstrator. It's called a VDS payload, and VDS stands for VHF Data Exchange System. VDS is actually a terrestrial system. It's kind of leveraging on the AES system, because you may exchange data between ships and between ship and shore. But in addition, you may enhance the system with the introduction of satellites. And with the introduction of satellites, you may increase the range between ships and ship and shore. So you get an integrated system. And it's one interesting aspect of such a system is that the IMO, they require AAS equipment on board most ships above a certain size and all ships carrying people. That means that if you enhance such a system, you may fairly quickly have a large market, because the VDS functionality can be built into the RX and TX equipment that already need to be on board. And we have worked over the last 3 years with the VDS. This is a timeline showing some of the activities. And from the timeline and upwards, you would see activities related to the technology development. And from the timeline and towards the bottom, you would see activities related to application based on such a technology. And one of the possible applications could be distribution of navigation augmentation for maritime users, not for aeronautical users. But we're also looking into a broader portfolio of services that such a low bandwidth, low capacity system, but also low cost, very low cost, can contribute with, also in the Arctic. Sorry. So that's the final slide on the VDS. With such a system, you can compare it with SMS services or multimedia services that we all use today via our cell phones. It's a store and forward system, but if you expand the number of satellites, of course, connectivity and the time from one message is sent somewhere to its reception at the other end will be reduced. Talking a little bit about the navigation radar detector that will come on board the NORSAT 3. A typical ship radar transmits signals, and these signals can be received by satellites. Of course, the satellites in this case would not look directly down towards the ground. They would look to the side so that the elevation angle where they are observing is fairly low. But this is something that we believe will enhance the safety and the detection of different ships, cooperative or not. The satellite, another satellite weighing about 20 kilos, moving in a polar orbit, some 550 to 700 kilometers off the ground. It will hopefully be launched early 2020. One project that I want to mention towards the end of my presentation is a project out of Norway called an Arctic High Elliptical Orbit satellite system. And if I have some assistance starting the animation here, you would see how the satellites would orbit the Earth compared to geostationary satellites, alternating the coverage over the Arctic. So this is a system that will consist of 2 satellites, and it will cover the Arctic and not much beyond the Arctic. Intended coverage area is above 65 degrees north. It's a system, it's a project undertaken by a Norwegian company called Space Norway. And the beauty of such a system is that it will guarantee you an elevation angle of probably in excess of 25-30 degrees in the entire Arctic, usually more, but that would be the minimum. And it will serve both commercial users and governmental users at sea, at land, and up in the air. It's not an application-specific system. It may provide broadband and narrowband capacity. It's very similar to a geostationary system, with the difference, of course, that you're talking about two satellites alternating to cover the area 24/7. It's got a very low number of handovers a day, which usually could create problems. The users may probably reuse their existing equipment that they are using with geostationary systems. We are also investigating from the Norwegian Space Center side the possibility of such a system to include payloads that would benefit aeronautical users, in particular navigation augmentation. The system, or the company behind the system, they are among the companies that have got a license to transmit signals over the American landmass by the FCC from November 2017. The RFP, the request for proposal, is supposed to go out in July, and with a tentative launch in 2022. So, in summary, I've spoken about the following. There's a growing interest for and presence in the Arctic. We see new satellite technologies and combined applications that are emerging. With more AS receivers in space, and with the addition of supporting technologies, we can improve the detection of the actual maritime traffic in the Arctic. New low-cost alternatives are emerging. It's already been mentioned also by the other panelists here that systems like SpaceX and OneWeb are coming. There will be new real-time high-throughput connectivity systems, and as been explained by Mr. Byers and Helfrich, we also see new satellites, new Earth observation satellites, bring new data sets to the table, and if they download the data through the KSAT network, go KSAT, then of course you can get the data with low latency almost globally. And this, in summary, will bring benefit to a large number of topics for people in and outside of the Arctic. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. So one of the things that that you've highlighted that I think is an important thing for our audience to keep in mind is that the growing interest in the Arctic is now. We talk about it a lot in some of our scientific discussions about how in the future there'll be more human presence and more activity in the Arctic, but the truth is it's happening now, as your slides have shown. And combining the satellite technologies increases the situational awareness in the Arctic, as well as in the polar regions in general. So thank you for that. Before we move on to another topic, I think Dr. Byers had a comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to say in follow-up to these three fabulous presentations that my colleagues have all been very polite in not highlighting the centrality of military functions for satellites in the Arctic. And because we're in Washington, D.C. today, I should say that roughly half of the 1,500 operational satellites at the moment are military satellites, and a lot of the other satellites are dual-use satellites. So the National Reconnaissance Office is the single largest purchaser of commercial remote sensing data in the world. That's not a bad thing, but it's a connection that needs to be out in the open. And satellites can enable militaries to save a lot of money. I've mentioned that search and rescue beacons and the supporting satellites save the Canadian government tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars each year in searches. We just do rescues now because we know where to go when someone's in trouble. RadarSat Constellation, 3 synthetic aperture radar satellites that will be launched later this year from Vandenberg, California, will eliminate the need for Canada to operate surveillance aircraft in the Arctic. We'll be able to do it all from space. The broadband system that this Norwegian company is developing will enable Norwegian F-35 fifth-generation fighter jets to operate to their maximum capabilities in the Norwegian high Arctic. The Canadian military is putting into place a similar system in North America so that we and our American allies will be able to fly fifth-generation fighter jets all the way to the North Pole. So the military dimension here is really important, and the connection with the civilian functions is complicated. Part of the reason that KSAT is having trouble in Canada is because the technology that will be coming through the KSAT facility in Inuvik through a U.S. company called Planet is so high resolution that it would have been top secret 10 years ago. It would have been military-grade imagery 10 years ago, and now it's commercially available, and the Canadian government is having to adapt to this new reality. RadarSat Constellation, again going up later this year from Canada, will be so advanced that it will not be commercially available at first. And so there's this time lag also, and managing that relationship in a fast-moving field is very difficult for both companies and governments.
So I appreciate these comments, and when we talk about earlier in the panel about the drivers of science and technology, they are so interrelated that it's hard sometimes to tell which came first. And I know for me right now, being the director of a data center that has, as I mentioned earlier, approximately 6 petabytes of data. It actually took us from 1991 to 2012 to get our first petabyte. And now we have 6. And with Sentinel-1 from ESA, we are growing very, very rapidly, and it's pushing our technology, not just on the ground here handling the amount of data, but even in the speeds. It took 30 years to double the speeds for science communications down to the ground. And now we're seeing in 10 years, it'll be another 2 orders of magnitude. So going from a multiple of 2 to a multiple of 100 is huge. So we're scrambling on the ground to keep up with the demand, the amount of data, the speed of the data, and the sheer quantity of it. And it is a very exciting thing to do. Coming up after RadarSat 3, there'll be the NISAR mission, which is the NASA ISRO. Again, an unprecedented collaboration between NASA and the Indian Space Agency, putting up a synthetic aperture radar satellite. We expect to have 150 petabytes in its 3 years of operations. It's a huge amount of data, and the amount of information that is packed into the data is unprecedented. So I know we have no time, but I would like to okay. I would like to take some questions. Thank you. Sir.
I'm Peter Humphrey. I'm an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. It seems like we are missing out on a massive opportunity for free ground truth, and that it might be possible to place moderately priced instrument packages on fishing vessels, icebreakers, tourist boats, military vessels, in real time generate long, skinny tracks of data to correlate to our satellites. Is that something the Arctic Council could push for? Is that something that NOAA could fund in part, inviting others to join the effort?
Well, I can't necessarily talk about what Arctic Council would necessarily wind up doing, but there is some efforts of these public-private partnerships that could get information into the hands of scientists as well as forecasters, so that they can utilize the systems of opportunity, the ships of opportunity that are available already in the Arctic. And in some cases, ships want to be known where they're at, and in the case of fishermen, they generally don't want you to know where they are, except in one small entity at least. They want maybe one person to know where they are from the forecast end, but they don't want to tell all the other fishermen where their good spots are. So there's making sure the communities can safeguard their interests is something that's would have to be worked on as well. But I think it's just a matter of creating the right environment for them to be able to share the information. And once you have that, then certain vessels would turn around and look to leverage that information. And I know in the Antarctic, they actually do a fair amount of citizen science on board most of the tour vessels that are going around the Antarctic. They have worked out with the Arctic tour operations how to necessarily get that information back over for citizen science.
This is an instrument package. Man is out of the loop.
Right.
Yeah, I was going to comment on that a little bit because this is a push-pull relationship. Because you used to have access to the ground and no satellites, and all of a sudden you'll get access to a bunch of satellites and then ground's lagging behind. So just give that circle one more loop, and there will be more ground truth measurements since you now have the means to collecting the data and sending the data back to whomever is going to use it. So I think we will see where you're aiming at in the not too distant future. And back to what you said before, Nadia, about the data, it's quite interesting because data is sort of your enemy and your foe here, because you want to have data, and if you don't have the data, you can't do anything with it. So you just have to cope with that relationship. But in the operational services, data is the thing you need as much as you can and as fast as you can. And again, to the comment about the military, it's really interesting because working together in, for example, meteorology on the US-European side, normally you have access to 4 polar orbiting satellites, but if you pull in the military guys, you get 6 operational satellites, and that means better data for all of us. So this is the way it has to go.
Yeah, thank you. And let's not forget that once you get the data, you have to get the information out of it. So this is when you say there's a friend and foe relationship with data providers and their data. Getting the right information, getting it in the right formats, getting it into the hands of the people who need it has been a big challenge for us in this industry for many, many years. And the Arctic Geodata Cooperative has been recently stood up. That is a cooperation between the Alaska Satellite Facility and GeoNorth, which is part of a native corporation, the Teletubby Corporation in Alaska. But in order to make it really soup to nuts, to get the data from the satellites into the hands of the people that we needed to form a larger cooperative. We've brought in Lockheed Martin, we've brought in NGA, and trying to get the data down to the earth, processed, create information products of it, and put it into the hands of the scientists or the rescuers or whoever is needing it at the time has been a challenge. So if I can do one more thing, I would like to just quickly go through my panelists. And we've been talking about science driving technology and how those also turn around and drive policy. My question to you is, what do you perceive as the strongest driver of new developments in Arctic science and development currently? And what is the barrier to progress?
I'll start with an honest answer. The single greatest factor in the Arctic is climate change. I mean, it's probably the single greatest factor globally, but in the Arctic especially, everything that happens in the Arctic now is derivative of climate change in some way. And the greatest barrier in this regard is the current U.S. administration's reluctance to finance satellite science of climate change.
Thank you. Sean?
I would say driver is the increased availability, I guess, of Arctic resources. So the idea that ships as well as people are looking to be able to operate in high latitudes is driving the need for better technologies for communications, for satellites, and monitoring of the activities there in a way that was not really thought about in decades before. And as far as challenges to doing that, a lot of it comes down to allowing technology to catch or to catch up with where the demand might be going. And it's kind of a chicken and egg scenario because people don't want to operate where they have big unknowns, and they don't want to operate into areas there might be danger. And until you actually have the technology in place, there's a reluctance to be able to make major investments into those areas.
Yeah, I pretty much follow what you're saying. It can be summarized in 3 words. It's more or less like information, knowledge, 4 actually, communication and international cooperation. If you
Thank you.
Yeah, I think actually the growing interest of the Arctic and us trying not to destroy it would actually also be of great importance. At the same time, with the growing interest and the growing presence, we need to ensure the safety of the people that live, work, and visit the Arctic through a combination of the technologies that we have illustrated here and talked about here today.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Dr. Mike Sfrega for bringing us here today, and to my esteemed colleagues, I appreciate this interesting panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nettie, and thank you to the panelists. We'll now transition to the second panel, which will be on business opportunities in a better connected Arctic. We heard some of that in the first panel, and we'll continue that discussion now into the second. After that panel, we'll take a brief break, and then we'll be joined by, at the end of the day, end of the morning, 2 keynote presentations. So if I can have the panelists for the second panel come on up, we'll rearrange name tags. We'll take a moment here. And then at the end of the second panel, we'll take a 5-minute break or so.
Oh, great, thanks. Yeah.
Your room now feels empty.
I know everyone went.
I'm sorry?
Everyone left?
Yeah, it seems like it. Are we
I do not.
We're not going to take a break now. We'll just go into the second panel, and then at the end of the second panel, we'll take a quick break. We're good? Thank you. Okay. Well, I'm joined here by 3 colleagues to talk about business opportunities in a better connected Arctic. And you can see the 2 themes obviously will overlap and then come together at the end of the morning as well. So to my left is Mr. Doug May. He represents the United States State Department, but today he'll be speaking from his participation in the Arctic Council Task Force on Improved Connectivity. Next to Doug is Tina Pidgeon, who is a strategic leader for legal, regulatory, compliance, and policy initiatives at GCI in Alaska. And to her left is Mr. Eirik Sivertsen, who is the chair of the Standing Committee of the Parliamentarians of the Arctic Region and also a member of Parliament in Norway. So I thank you, 3 of you, for coming here this morning and for talking about these important issues. Doug, perhaps I can just start off with you, set some context and work of the committee and other things related to the work that you do each day. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Mike. To begin, much of what you heard this morning from the experts will be repeated here because the experts were what fed into the task force. That of the last 2 years, we had a first task force from the Arctic Council, and now we're in a second task force, which is the improved connectivity that you mentioned. So I'll just address a few minutes on the previous task force to sort of show what we learned and then where we're going from here. And I'm joined in the room by a couple people who served on the task force with me, so that'll be helpful in case there's a question I can't answer. Maybe I can look to them to help me out. Runa Sandbakken and Tina Pidgeon. So thank you very much. The first task force, our mandate was to look at the telecommunications infrastructure in the Arctic. Try to do a snapshot, try to give the ministers of the Arctic Council states a good idea of sort of where we are from an infrastructure perspective. So we did look at the range of services from satellite services, landlines, optic cables, fixed wireless, satellite or mobile wireless, and then also some radio type services. What we asked each government to do was to sort of compile the data of their networks and infrastructure in the Arctic. And we had some pretty compelling, what we call heat maps, or pictures of the country that showed where connectivity existed, whether it was cellular, landline, or other types of services. And an easy conclusion once you saw those heat maps, and I apologize, I don't have those pictures with me, but you had basically half the Arctic states, the Nordic states, very well connected, lots of infrastructure, and so the heat maps were very colorful and quite thorough because of the connectivity that existed. And then you had the Alaska, northern Canada, northern Russia, Greenland situation where you had incredible territories with very little infrastructure in place. And so as ministers, you wanted to tell them, look, as you think about what to do about telecommunications in the future, obviously you need to bring your own perspectives, but there are different types of scenarios and different types of uses or goals that you might have. So if you're one of the, like northern Canada or northern Russia, you have to think about how do we provide that basic connectivity to people that live and work there. Whereas if you're in the Nordic states, maybe that's not your first primary goal, but maybe you're looking more at the maritime or aeronautical type demands. So those were some of the conclusions that came out of the first task force, was just a nice heat map or look of the infrastructure that existed. Also, you've heard it a little bit today about the satellite connectivity. When you look at geostationary satellites, or satellites that are over the equator of the United States, or the United States, or over the world, geostationary satellites begin to lose connectivity somewhere around 75 degrees north, just because of the curvature of the Earth. And so you do need alternative satellite technologies to help provide connectivity. And you heard a little bit about highly elliptical orbits, polar orbiting satellites. So if you look at those technologies, that's where you're going to get a little bit more coverage and connectivity for the Arctic. And those new systems, the OneWebs, the SpaceX, Iridium's next system, which is an improvement of their current system, that's where you're seeing some new opportunities for the Arctic. In addition to that, you're also seeing the undersea cables. You heard Quintillion mentioned. The government of Finland is also looking at doing undersea cable through the Arctic. There's going to be opportunities there. There's going to be some new connectivity that didn't exist today. And so we call it out to ministers to let them know improvements are happening. And the question is, what do we do with it? How do we take advantage of those opportunities? You talk about the dispersed range of users in the Arctic. You also have a dispersed need, lots of ideas for how you're going to solve these connectivity needs. And that's why nobody's going to solve all the problems. Not one satellite technology, another satellite technology, not just having fiber through the ocean. You're going to need everybody working together to solve all the different types of problems. I think an interesting thing that came out, at least for me, in that first task force is these Quintillion undersea cables, these new satellite projects. What you're finding is they're not building those systems just to serve the Arctic. They're actually building those systems to actually serve other markets. In the case of the undersea cables, the goal there is to go from Asia to Europe in a shorter route, quicker path, so you get that data that everybody wants, you get it quicker. So the interesting thing is, in satellite systems, same thing. They're not being built to serve the Arctic. They're just going to be going over the poles simply because of the path of their orbits. Those are opportunities for the Arctic, and that's why I say you got to take advantage of those opportunities. You got to learn about them, figure out how they can help the Arctic, and then work with those systems, talk to them, let them know that the Arctic is a thriving place, that there are opportunities there that are unmet, and we'd like to take advantage of those systems. So I think that's a good thing to keep in mind as other projects develop. Sort of how is it happening that they could serve the Arctic, even though that wasn't their original intent or their original design. You've heard about all the different needs and the different users, whether it's navigation, it's aeronautical, it's search and rescue, it's scientific. There's just a lot of need, and connectivity doesn't really exist today that serves all those needs. And so again, as Arctic states, we got to look for how we can help provide better connectivity and take advantages of the information that exists up there, how we transport it, get better information and better analysis. Another conclusion that comes out of the Arctic is you get anchor tenants or anchor customers where you might build a military installation. We don't talk too much about the military in this task force, but if you have a military installation or you have an oil and gas installation or you have a scientific research facility that brings in perhaps some significant connectivity for that purpose, what you quickly learn is that's your anchor customer. You can build off from there. You can mesh off of there and serve local communities. And so the question is, how do we take advantage of those opportunities, whether it's private industry like oil and gas or whether it's government such as military or scientific research. So again, we just called those ideas out into the report for the ministers. The benefits obviously are also good for the indigenous populations. You have more economic opportunities there, and so they can also thrive and take advantage of those technologies if and when they become available. So that was the conclusion of the first task force, and there's a report that's published. It is public. Perhaps we could provide the link and people could take a look at that. It sort of gave you a good snapshot in time, but of course that is a snapshot in time, and as we move on, it's going to lose its value over time. So the question is, what do we do next? The Arctic Council did decide to continue to focus on this telecommunications work. The U.S. chairmanship was the first one to sort of launch telecommunications. I'll acknowledge Dave Bolton, who's in the room with us today. It was the U.S. team that really put this as a task force in the Arctic Council. And then the Finns came along, and now they've got another task force, which is the improved connectivity that you mentioned. And the question is, what will we do from here? So the mandate of this current task force is to build on what we learned and start to figure out how we can, in fact, fill those gaps or help identify solutions to the gaps that are of concern today. We've met with industry. We had one meeting at the Embassy of Norway here in Washington just last month, where we had satellite providers, local providers, some radio communications companies, some solutions providers, all talking about the Arctic and sort of getting together in one room to figure out what it is they're doing and how we can take advantage of that, and also let them know what the demand side is. And again, this included the SpaceX, the OneWebs, the Quintillions, these others. And the story is good. I mean, there really are some things that are coming, and I think this task force's responsibility will be to represent that story to the ministers in a fair and a balanced way. I don't want to oversell what's coming because we have to see it, right? It hasn't been launched in many cases. We have to prove it, and then from that we can build and sort of explore how we can improve connectivity in the Arctic. So that's really the task force that exists right now. The conclusion is going to be a report to the ministers again, and I think key for that, in my mind, is going to be what do we recommend as far as the future work in the Arctic Council, because I do think there's an understanding in the Arctic Council that telecommunications is core to all the work that's going on, whether it's science, whether it's indigenous, whichever the case is. So how do we put in a sort of a longer-term effort to resource this work and continue to improve connectivity in the Arctic? So we'll look at it, and hopefully we'll have a good report and a good outcome at the end of this chairmanship. Thank you.
Thank you. I know that there will be follow-up questions from the audience, so I will save mine along with the audience as well. But we go literally from outer space and vehicles like the technologies that the first panel covered to a body like the Arctic Council trying to grapple with not only what assets are available, identifying what's available, but how you might leverage these assets for the good of scientific community, research community, the education community, the medical community, on and on. So there's so many built-in questions and follow-ups to be had there. But that's a perfect segue, Tina, to your work and what you're doing with GCI in the state of Alaska, because for me it's coming literally from further than the 50,000-foot level to really on the ground serving communities. So I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Mike. I mean, the notion of bringing the communications to the ground is actually a perfect metaphor while we talk about satellites today and how that contributes to the delivery of broadband services to communities throughout the Arctic. And first, I want to thank the Wilson Center, the Norwegian Embassy, and Arctic Frontiers for coming together to make discussion of this topic possible. I find so often when we talk about the availability of broadband to communities in the Arctic, that unfortunately at times satellite gets lost in the shuffle, and it is and will continue to be a very important piece of that puzzle to ensure not only that we have services to as many communities and as many individuals as possible, but also to ensure that the services we're providing using other technologies to communities are reliable and are backed up and can remain functional in operating in the Arctic, which, as many of you know, can be quite a challenge. So I wanted to start with just a little bit of table setting of who GCI is for some of you who may not know if you have not received services in Alaska before. We're the leading provider of broadband throughout Alaska. The company has grown from a 3-person startup in the late 70s to a company now of over 2,200 employees, and we provide services using a mix of technologies to over 170 communities in Alaska. And it's been a pleasure also working with Doug and in the last task force, Runa and others, really in terms of putting those stories together, the experience of what it takes to serve in the Arctic, and really sharing those shared experiences of successes, what's worked, the barriers, and really learning from what people are doing really throughout this Arctic region, and be able to put those experiences to use more directly and bring those back home, which is why I really enjoy understanding what different technologies are coming, and the discussion of the previous panel. So really often when we talk about communications in the Arctic, it is really a tale of two Arctics. In the early 80s, GCI's mission was to deliver long-distance services across the state. And it's kind of quaint to think about that now when no one even goes out really to buy long distance anymore. But that's how the company got its start. And at that point, satellite was the key technology, and advancements in satellite technology, which we helped introduce, eliminated what's called double hop. And so at that point, people had very expensive long-distance services, often not usable. As technologies and demand developed, people couldn't utilize fax services. Again, something that you don't really hear about today, but was very important at that point in time. But now that technology has advanced to broadband, and we're really in the midst of a global digital revolution, and if we are not able to use all the technologies that are available, the combination of satellite, of wireless, of microwave, of fiber, to deliver services to Arctic communities, then really just the basic experience that we have as a shared global community will pass by people of the Arctic. And so really it's as the individual and community needs have evolved in this way, so has the mission of our company. So what this slide illustrates is that in many ways, it's often just important to take a step back and define actually where in the Arctic these issues become a challenge. We serve many fiber-rich communities. Actually, I think in Alaska we can boast more than any other state in the country, in the United States, that more than half of our Alaska residents have access to gig data speeds. And there's no other state here in the U.S. who can say that. So in our fiber-rich communities, we can make these services available. And that's where you see on your left Anchorage as an example. Do I have my right and my left?
They're left.
They're left. Okay. Anyway, you can tell
on the screen.
You can tell the difference on the screen, which is which. Now, the community that you see on this side at Mutluk, there we actually have been able to deliver important wireless-based services. We can do that over satellite, we can do it over microwave, we can do it via fiber. In this community in particular, it's provided via microwave. But really the technologies all arose out of the original capability of being able to connect communities using satellite connectivity. And this really illustrates that when you're talking about serving communities in the Arctic, it's not really the local distribution facilities. It's easy enough to put a tower or cell system in the middle of a pretty densely populated, or at least in terms of where individuals live. It's not a lot of dirt between the light bulbs, so to speak. It's literally, you might have a small number of population, but they're actually in the community, fairly easy to reach. It's really how do you take those signals from the community back to another location, middle mile or transport as we call it. But as you can see, here are two very different examples of where we've been able to actually help overcome some of the challenges of serving in the Arctic. But there are other locations where the digital divide continues to be real, and that's where I see the continued promise and opportunity of satellite. Here I just want to highlight so many of the issues for bridging the digital divide in the Arctic are exacerbated there than compared, I think, in many other locations in the world. And many of you, I'm sure, are living that and know that firsthand. But add to that the fact that there are very few technologies that are specifically designed to function and operate in an Arctic environment. And you've really elevated the challenge one step further, that it's not just low populations, dispersed populations, difficult climates, difficult environments to serve in, and unpredictability. Add on to that it's actually you have to cause technologies to do something in an environment that they're just not designed to operate in. And I think that makes all the more important the role of satellite here, because the backup for those services really becomes essential. There's another challenge that I want to highlight, and that has to do with regulatory challenges, and you heard a little bit about that in the last panel in terms of getting licensing. There are actually, I think, two other critical challenges that I want to highlight. One is that as a company and a very heavy user of satellite services, we're seeing diminished coverage over time, at least over the U.S. Arctic. As satellites reach end of life, we're not seeing additional or new satellites come in to provide the same type of coverage. And that's a significant issue. The other thing we're seeing in the U.S. in particular is a demand, an insatiable demand for continued and more frequencies to support mobile applications. And where there's a proceeding right now at the FCC to look at this, the 3.5 gigahertz proceeding, where there really is an effort that will likely in some way, shape, or form be successful to reclaim some of the spectrum that's available today to support C-band satellite operations and utilize it for mobile data services. The issue is not whether that's right or wrong, good or bad. The issue is, as we see some of these other promising satellite technologies come into existence, or the projects, the LEO projects, we really have to ensure that there's an appropriate transition so that the new satellite systems of the future are able to actually fill the gaps from some very critical communications functions that happen today, especially utilizing C-band spectrum, and that environment, that ecosystem doesn't disappear before new alternatives are available. So I'd like to show you, here's what we call the broadband map of 2010. There are many advancements happening. And as you can see, every place where there's not a line and you see a community, that's a community that would be served by satellite as the primary basis to connecting that community. If I fast forward to 2017, you see that there's been really in 7 years a massive deployment of terrestrial-based systems and services throughout the state of Alaska. And I highlight that here in this discussion about satellites, not necessarily to say that satellites are being replaced, but that actually this type of deployment makes it possible to utilize and to repurpose the satellite spectrum and the satellite capabilities to the communities that need it most. And then likewise, we rely very heavily on satellites to be able to back up these systems that tend to break in the presence of ice, that get sometimes disturbed because of, we have actually in Askenuk right now, we've had a microwave system that has been covered in ice, and that because we can't send individuals in to clear it because of fear of the ice falling and actually crushing them, what did we do? We turned to our satellite backup system. So maybe doesn't provide the exact same level of services, but it ensures that a community doesn't lose its connectivity. And finally, here is from our company's investments, you see a mix of all the different technologies working together. And I think much in the way as Runa was discussing, where you have satellite technologies working together, here's an example where you have multiple different types of technologies working together to deliver the best service possible to as many people as possible. So now I just want to turn to some of the practical applications of what that means for individuals and communities. First, we hear a lot about, in general, the increase in education opportunity or increase in education quality. We've seen high schools win international competitions, teaming up with scientists at NASA and NOAA to solve real-world problems like forecasting seismic activity. In one school district that doesn't have highly qualified teachers for subjects, they're using high-def, two-way interactive video to deliver quality teachers into communities that maybe, might have all students in one school. Maybe you only have a couple of teachers. You can't possibly have each of those teachers, two teachers expert in all areas. This allows communities to share their resources and disperse resources in a number of communities, and then in their overall region of interest be able to share those resources. And we're entering an age where class subjects will be able to be brought to life using augmented and virtual reality, and these capabilities are really, with broadband, be able to deliver that to all communities of the Arctic. In the area of healthcare, Alaska is really leading in telemedicine because of the connectivity. And the types of capabilities I'm describing are capable regardless of the technology, and that includes satellite. There's often a lot of discussion about the difficulties of satellite to deliver broadband services. The fact of the matter is, you just need to be able to deploy either enough of it or enough of it using IP technologies that use the resource efficiently. And if you can ensure that you have applications that are actually designed for satellite, you can deliver these same capabilities no matter what the underlying technology is. So in telemedicine, patients are able to stay with their families when they're getting treated. We can ensure electronic medical record deployment compliance, reducing expensive and risky transport, access to specialists, connecting to life-saving treatment. But even setting those, really sort of gee whiz applications aside, imagine being able to be treated by a dentist once or twice a year when otherwise you would have to actually leave your community to do that. Or if your child has an earache, actually being able to, instead of flying hundreds of miles to Anchorage, you could be treated in your community. That's what this technology provides to the communities of Alaska. Economic development is significant. We've started to see a lot more Amazon boxes come into communities that have access to broadband. It provides options, in some cases better prices. It drives businesses. And we also see here really the synergistic effect of being able to drive demand and usage in communities. And when you can support perhaps a business like a mine, like Red Dog Mine in the northwest part of Alaska, the presence of that mine and the ability to support communications through satellite actually developed the demand to later come in and invest in terrestrial facilities, which ends up providing collateral benefit to the local communities. In the area of safety and security, we're using weather cams, and it has literally saved lives. It's reduced weather-related aviation accidents in rural Alaska by 85%. And a note that I'm taking back with me is to look up whether or not we're actually utilizing an example that Dr. Byers mentioned, issuing beacons in communities. A lot of times we're trying to force a square peg into a round hole when we talk about national approaches to safety and security. I think this is one instance where in the Arctic it may make more sense to think about what really fits for the communities in increasing safety as opposed to a nationally applied solution that maybe doesn't work in the far north of Alaska. And finally, I wanted to mention community and culture. In here, I think it's not so much just bringing what's happening in the world into the Arctic, but really bringing all the rich occurrences, creativity, and experiences in the Arctic and being able to bring them to the rest of the world. But clearly, if you think back to one of the first maps, there's still a lot of spaces, not only in Alaska, but throughout the Arctic, where the level of communications may not be as robust as we all would wish, and how do we drive that forward? And I think really two examples of what I put in the category of game changers are projects. Where can you bring in infrastructure projects and thereby in joint projects be able to lower the cost of deployment and really facilitate piggybacking on a road, for example, to come in and lay fiber. And then likewise, how can we promote economic development that drives demand? So that I think that's really the least expensive way of bringing in communications technology. If you have the anchor tenants, the economic drivers actually supporting them, and then you bring business in that says, we actually want to provide this service. We don't need government to pay for it. There's someone there, there's a customer there, and if we bring it to that customer that has a large amount of demand, we'll bring it to the rest of the community as well. But sometimes it's not just about what can we do on the ground, it's where is technology developing. And here, it's a combination of what are the economic drivers and what is the technology, how can we ride innovation. And here I just want to talk in a little bit more detail about the low Earth orbit projects that are being discussed. There's a lot of promise there, reduces latency, increases the broadband capabilities and performance for your average end user. And there's a number of different factors at work that's making that possible. We have commercialized production of satellites, predictable launch systems, and really the ability to look at global demand as opposed to a single community demand. As Doug said, there's a lot to be hopeful about and a lot in the mix. But I also think it's important when we're talking about services in the Arctic to be realistic. And I don't mean pessimistic, I mean realistic, that if we actually think ahead about what those challenges are and how to address them, that it really increases the prospect of those projects being successful. And here I think one of the big challenges with any of the LEO systems and looking at serving on a community or individual basis, it's what does that receive system look like? Is it operational in the Arctic? Is it actually capable of somebody being able to take it into their home and put it on the house in communities where you're not going to have teams of technicians to come implement systems and make them workable? All of those issues I think are addressable, but they're ones that unless we think about them up front and communicate with the supporters of these projects, the projects themselves are going to be less able to deliver the kind of benefit that we believe is possible. So this truly is an exciting time, I think, for connectivity and broadband in the Arctic. We have the focus, we have available tools, we have solutions in sight. But really, unless we can keep our individual efforts, I think, organized, directed, and realistic, we need to do those things to keep that promise as near in time and as effective as it possibly can be. So just a couple of closing thoughts. Technological neutrality is important. There's a lot of discussion and excitement about fiber, about wireless, and I think just because we're talking about it in this room, I have continued confidence that we'll keep satellite in the mix, but it really is important. And I think with this kind of focus and pushing innovation across all platforms, that will continue to bring broadband in the Arctic and continue to make some of these exciting prospects capable, available for the citizens, communities of the Arctic, and all the important projects and initiatives that we've talked about today as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Tina, very much. Now, again, I want to reserve questions for the audience, but Eric, thank you for joining us. A number of hats here, a member of parliament in Norway, but also the Arctic parliamentarians is a big part of your work as well. And during the first panel and now during this panel, and I know later on after our short break we'll have a discussion with Senator Murkowski. I can't help but wonder how many times you've heard, how are you going to make all of this happen? Not just in your own country, but really across the Arctic. And so I know you have some prepared notes, but also I think about the ways in which lawmakers have to grapple with taking care of their own country, but also then looking at the North as well, and how you leverage all of the demands, how you manage all the demands, but then how you sync all of those up to look at a more global perspective on all of these challenges.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you for having me. And thank you to the Wilson Center, the Norwegian Embassy, and of course Arctic Frontier for organizing this. And thank you to all the speakers we have heard this morning. I think it's a very lot of wise people being here talking to us. You forgot one of the most important hats I have, because I am an inhabitant of the Arctic. I am living north of the Arctic Circle, but not in the American Arctic. As you mentioned, there's, during the American chairmanship, I was arguing that there are no such things as one Arctic. That was somewhat difficult for the Americans because the slogan for the chairmanship was one Arctic. But I think we settled that. But it's important to know that there's differences between Alaska, the northern part of Canada, Greenland, Iceland, the Nordic countries, which are very developed. But it's about, and this is, I'll be brief so we have some time for questions and discussions. For me, as an elected representative of the people of the North, this is about the well-being of the people in the North, first and foremost. And we have to have that insight when we are discussing how to develop, how to utilize new technology opportunities, new economic opportunities, looking into the threats. But to your question, Mike, this is one of the dilemmas that we always meet as lawmakers, because the technology will always be had. We always struggle to keep up, and it has to be that way. Because if not, we would invent the technology and the laws in the same time. And I'm not an expert on technology. So we have to stand in that dilemma all the way. And one key question we have to discuss here is who's going to pay for the opportunities. Because in a modern world, I think digital infrastructure is fundamental for good living. I and my fellow inhabitants at Svalbard, or for that sake in Greenland, they want to see Netflix in 2018. Why shouldn't they? This is a part of a good modern life. So how do we provide that? In a vast area of around 14 million square kilometers landmass in the Arctic, an equal amount of sea. How do we do that? Who is going to pay? And then we are in the point that several have mentioned this morning, the discussion about the egg and the chicken. And I will argue that when we are looking into the Arctic, at least if I take a Norwegian approach on this, we are saying that our future and economic development will be in the north in the future. We are saying that we will, for an example, five-double our export intakes from marine and maritime activities. 80% of the Norwegian seas are in the north. But how are we going to do that if we don't invest in infrastructure? And this is very expensive. And who is going to take the huge bill the first time? Is it commercial? Then we have to wait. Is it national? Well, then the taxpayers have to pay up, and you have to explain and have them understand why this is important, because we will have some income decades into the future. This is a very hard discussion to take in the public. I heard Mr. Baez say today that he was happy that Canada has stepped back from their satellite project. I'm very happy that the Norwegian Parliament last week, after 2 years with assessment and considerations, decided to have 2 satellites in telecommunications satellites, because that's necessary infrastructure to move forward. We can't just wait for new technology to come, because it will always be a new technology coming. So we have to start somewhere. I'm glad to say that the price is somewhat lower than Mr. Byers was mentioning. I think the Norwegian government is assessing this to be around $400 million, and it will also have a commercial part, and I think that's important. But I won't repeat what everyone has been saying, but let me finish up by saying this is about the right for the people in the north to have equal opportunities like the rest of the world. Because we also face the 3 major global trends. Is the urbanization. People are moving out of the scarcely populated areas of the Arctic into cities. And they often move to cities further south. And if we are going to utilize the opportunities in the north, how are we going to do that if there are no people there? I can't see how we could do that. And do we wish the area to be empty of people? It's the climate changes, which I totally agree. That is the most important driver for changes now. And we will be hit first and hardest in the north. And the last one is, of course, the digitalizations. Everyday life will be impossible without connections to bank services, healthcare, education. For businesses, you have to have no businesses today, or in a few years, will be able to operate without connections. And of course, for the governments, it's science, it's about surveillance, it's operations. And let me finish up by search and rescue. In November, we had a terrible, tragic accident at Svalbard because a Russian helicopter with 8 people aboard went down in the sea. And when I met with the governor of Svalbard in Sysselmannen, which is the Norwegian term for it, in March, she said that, well, the lack of communications and possibilities for communications was a hinder for more efficient operations. We managed, because after a time you put up some release, you use other technologies, but to start with, this was a hinder for efficient operations, and that's just a few kilometers out of Longyearbyen, which is a quite good infrastructure point in the Arctic. So we have the needs, and we have to move forward. Therefore, I'm glad we are meeting here today, and I hope we could do some joint efforts to move forward and not just talk about it, because we have heard it hundreds of times. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I very much appreciate you bringing it even further into the community, into reality. Many of us share in the audience and up here this sense of urgency about all things to the Arctic, but I think you just hit to the core of that, and it's about serving our communities. In the interest of time, I'd like to open it up to the audience for some questions. Let's see, we have microphones on the right and on the left. I see, well, why don't we take Mead first, and then we'll come down here, and then we'll go off to my right. Mead?
Thanks, Mike and members of the panel. I'm Mead Treadwell. I have been chair of a Polar Advisory Board for Iridium. And my question for the panel really is how we can take some of our new capabilities and integrate it with the needs that you've talked about here, and how we can get these different technological efforts together in the Arctic. I think it's very good that the Arctic Council has this umbrella discussion, but you know, you get different companies showing up, but nobody's saying, okay, how do we you know, match these capabilities to do this? We've got 66 new satellites going up, another launch schedule soon. We've just gotten IMO approval for high latitude, or for GMDSS, but it's high latitude maritime, so that's very positive. ADS-B capability will be aboard the Constellation, so we'll have global tracking of commercial aircraft, which is positive. AIS, we saw AIS technology in the last panel, and Harris and Exact Earth will be delivering AIS all around, and we'll be able to fill in some of the satellite gaps maybe before the before the new LEO networks that have been discussed with the Certus system, land mobile, and lots of machine to machine. And I guess the question is, how do we take what Norway is thinking about doing, is asking for government-to-government cooperation, and join it with these other commercial efforts so that we actually aren't duplicating, but instead are expanding investment and expanding capability.
Who would like to take the one first? Doug?
I know Tina will be better at this than me, but I'll give it a shot.
Gosh, I was thinking you were going to say so.
The great thing about industry, and especially this high-tech industry, is they're so innovative. When we met with industry last month, one of the key things that came away from that meeting was, while they're good, innovative solutions providers, they need to understand the problem that's intended to be solved. And they expressed an interest in learning more about the Arctic and what the needs are and exactly where the challenges are to figure out whether or not they're poised to solve those problems. I think that's going to be something key for our report, is to call out that need for that interaction, or to bring forth whatever expertise we have in the Arctic to demonstrate and to meet with industry to say, hey, here's the problems we're having. I think the maritime industry obviously has a long history with communications providers, but are there challenges that are unique to the Arctic, for example, that we should make them aware of, whether it's scientific research or indigenous as well? You know, what challenges do they have that are not being met? So I think there's a need there to bring us together and to figure out how we can work together, because I do think they're good at providing solutions if they understand the problem. So that's my first reaction to your question, Mead. I'll see if Tina has others to say.
I guess I'll just add, and Iridium was a participant as well in that session. And I guess I think, in my opinion, Mead, something that you're pointing to is not only an issue necessarily about this topic, but really just more globally about how we discuss these issues and where we provide the right forum, that we're not just talking about a group of issues and a group of solutions, and they're all kind of in this one big ball of wax, and we're talking about them, but how do we actually parse apart, you know, what is the challenge or the need, and what are the specific solutions that match that specific challenge and need, and let that off on its path, and then do that serially in an orderly way. And I guess I don't offer that to say that in some ways the discussions that we've been having not in the wrong way. I don't think that's the case. I just think we've gotten to the need for the next step, and doing exactly the kind of thing that you've said. So maybe it ultimately comes back to you, Mike, but that's my bigger picture observation.
Eric, do you have any comments on that? And then I'll share some thoughts.
Just short, I agree. You have to bring the actors together. You have to academia, you have to bring in the business, you have to bring the government. And I maybe think that the Arctic Economic Council could be one facilitator for these discussions, because I think if we are going to have synergies between the different operators, we have to agree upon some standards, some interfaces, so we don't duplicate, as Mead is talking about. Maybe we could have a slightly different approach to evolving innovations and competition in the Arctic than in the rest of the world. That government interference not is a threat, but an opportunity also for the businesses to utilize better the strengths of each of the companies or operators.
Thank you. A couple of things that when we first thought about this idea, and I want to thank my colleagues from Arctic Frontiers for focusing on this very issue today. We wanted to do two things. One was to communicate and share what's happening. The second was to discover what issues might we tease out in the future, and who are the likely partners for those issues to do exactly what I think we're all suggesting here. Is that's a big elephant. and we need to take pieces of the issue and then maybe bring them together, bring the right players together to solve one particular component of the larger issue. And that might be something that we look at in the future. So this is very helpful to us because I think we all have a role here. And I think we're all looking for the forum as well. And it might be a relationship between the Arctic Circle, Arctic Economic Council, industry, think tanks, but I think we're at that next step now. Next question down here on my left.
Yes, I'm Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet TV, and Mike, thank you, and Sherry for putting this together, and to the Norwegian Embassy, and also for Arctic Frontiers. But coming out of this, it's very interesting. We have a global television program. We're reaching into many communities, and we've been asked by the state of West Virginia to help them on their last mile. 65 to 75% of their people really have no broadband access or very spotty access. And you're talking about, Tina, of what you're doing in Alaska, which seems to be way beyond what many states are doing in the lower 48. So getting back to, Eric, what you mentioned as far as connectivity and the other speakers and even the first panel, is how do we share all this? And this comes back again, Michael, to what you were just talking about. How do we share this, get the information out there, and identify what's actually the best practices that are really working, and then move beyond just the politics and, you know, the economics of those, and to ways that we actually reach people. And then the last point is, how do we tie in the indigenous peoples of the Arctic into all this? Because we're talking about satellites, all these fancy technologies, but you got people on the ground that are living it on a day-to-day basis, and they are beacons in themselves to what we need to be doing and learning about climate change in the Arctic. Thank you for being here.
Eric, do you want to?
Yeah, I agree about the indigenous people. I think they are also inhabitants of the Arctic. When we are moving into this should be the foundation also for how do we, what kind of problem are we trying to solve. But then we do have to talk with the inhabitants and ask, what are your problem? What do you want to do? But I think you made a very important point about culture, because of course I will argue that I am dependent on Facebook and Google and Netflix, but bringing the Arctic out to the world. Because for us, many of us traveling around the world here, meeting people and discussing the Arctic, but the perception of the Arctic is often very, very wrong. I being in Brussels, it's getting better, but it's still outspread perception that there are polar bears in the streets in the northern part of Norway, that there are very few people living on the mainland and so forth. So we have also a need to bring culture out. But the foundation will be and has to be the people living in the north. Ask them and you will get answer. They are experts on living in the Arctic.
So it really is an issue of attracting the right dialogue and making good things happen. It's also projecting the reality of the North as well. Another question. Here in the front, Nettie.
Thank you. So I wanted to kind of go back to something that Eric said earlier about the urbanization and potentially having less and less people in the Arctic. I actually see it the opposite way as we bring forward the technologies that Tina is talking about and lift up the technological abilities of these relatively isolated villages. Don't we allow them to stay and still be a part of the modern world by bringing the technologies to them?
I agree, and that has to be one part of this. But also the people, we have to acknowledge that also the people in the Arctic, we started to move into cities about 9,000 years ago. Then we invented the concept. And since people have been moving into cities, in 2007, 2008, more than half of the population in the world lived in cities. And we think that at the end of this century, 3/4 of the population will live in cities. It's no reason to think that that will not apply to the Arctic. So how do we secure that people want to stay in cities in the Arctic, then we have to have connectivity also for the Arctic. So I agree.
I wanted to add that the point of urbanization is one that is not without cost. And there's a lot of discussion about how do we pay for delivering services to the Arctic. And I think the missing piece of that question is, what do we avoid paying for if we bring and keep services in the Arctic and allow people to make their homes and have a livelihood and live their culture? We actually are, it's not just the cost of that, but it's also the cost that we avoid by having people uproot their lives and their communities because they want to be able to find services in a more urban environment. And I think that goes directly to helping to solve the question about how we bring services to communities, as well as ensuring we're looking at both sides of that equation and not just one side of it. And I'm just bringing it back also to the point about West Virginia, and that is being able to find where we have similarities of solutions and being able to provide case studies of what has worked in the past in certain locations and why, and figuring out, utilizing the data that we know is out there and should be accessible to be able to match up those solutions with the problems that they solve. And the Arctic, I think, has both something to contribute to those global solutions and something to take away from those global solutions, even outside of the Arctic as well.
Thank you.
Eric, you mentioned the Arctic Economic Council. In fact, we did work with them in the first go-round of our task force. They have a telecommunications group themselves. Yep. And in fact, Suvi Linden is now heading that up going forward. They're having another meeting this year, but I went to their broadband summit in Barrow 2 summers ago. And the great thing about that event, like you said, is it brings that cultural aspect and that local community aspect into the conversation. It was a great opportunity for us to learn from that. And so we took notes and obviously incorporated that information into our report. And I hope we keep doing that because, again, they're much closer to the industry side and the indigenous side. And I think we need to continue to explore that relationship and take advantage of it.
Well, thank you. Well, I want to take a moment to thank our panel for an excellent discussion. I think it piggybacks off of the first discussion we had earlier this morning and sets the right foundation for what will happen in about 5 or 10 minutes from now, which will be a discussion with Eric and with Senator Murkowski as well. So I'd like to take a 5-minute break. We'll come back. We'll have Senator Murkowski and Eric speak, and then we'll have a dialogue. Please thank the panel for their interesting insights. While we're switching from coffee break, we're also switching to Facebook Live. So I'm waiting to get the thumbs up. Okay, now we are here in person in Washington, D.C. We are streaming live on the web, and we are on Facebook Live at the moment. So I think we have all things covered. Thank you all for, again, coming this morning and listening to 2 very dynamic and interesting, insightful discussions on issues of telecommunications and satellite communications in the Arctic to serve the people of the Arctic. We have with us today one of the most strong proponents of the people of the North, and we've already heard from Eric. We have with us the senior senator from the state of Alaska, Lisa Murkowski, who has not just been a champion for the state of Alaska and for the United States, but truly a friend of the people of the Arctic and one of the voices in this town in Washington, D.C. that always takes the opportunity to talk about the importance of Alaska to the United States, the importance of Alaska to the circumpolar North, and the importance of the 8 nations and friends of the 8 nations acting in a very cooperative manner in the North. So with that, would you please welcome to the podium Senator Lisa Murkowski.
Thanks, Mike. Mike, thank you. It's good to be back at the Wilson Center. When I come to this building anymore, when I drive by the Reagan Center, this is one of I think it's the largest federal building in the city, maybe in the country. I just look at it and think of it as the Arctic Center, because this is where we seem to be hosting these just significant conversations. So my thanks to the Wilson Center, to the Polar Institute. Mike, thank you for the opportunity to be with you. Good to see a lot of friends. There are many who have come from far distances, and we welcome you. I'd also like to do a quick welcome to a good handful of my interns. They joined my office last week. They're from all parts of the state, from Nuiqsut to Ketchikan, and young people that have just graduated from high school. So they've heard me talk with a great deal of enthusiasm about the Arctic, and so to have them here with us today to be part of these important conversations is just great. It's always hard to give remarks or welcoming remarks when the welcomes have come and gone and the substance has come and gone. And so I'm kind of here doing the wrap up, if you will. When you're in the Senate, when you're on a committee, you are you're called upon to ask your questions based on your seniority within the committee. So by the time they finally get down to you and say you're number 16 on the committee, it's kind of tough to kind of come up with anything that's fresh and new. And used to be a time that when you brought up the issue of the Arctic, that was new. Nobody was likely to have brought it up. So it was always a great opportunity for me to ask that first question in an area that would prompt great conversation. The good news for us is that so much of that has changed over the past few years, and more are viewing with great interest all that is going on in the Arctic. It is no longer a parochial Alaska issue. When we have dignitaries like my friend Eric Severson, Eric is the chair of the Arctic parliamentarians. Eric and I have been on, we've served as Arctic parliamentarians for at least a dozen years.
At least you.
Yeah, at least me. He is significant in so many ways. But for those who have, again, traveled so far, to be here to talk about the issues of communication and space technology and how exciting that is as an opportunity for us in the Arctic. When we think about how we're linked in the Arctic by culture, by language, by the challenges, the opportunities, I think we know that we are better for it. We are money ahead, if you will, if we are working together. And when it comes to satellite coverage for the Arctic, we know that this is not something just for a single nation. It's a regional issue. It's a global issue. I am reminded of this daily. I have an incredible piece of art that is in my office now that happens to have been painted by my goddaughter. And it is the view of the globe, as I believe it should be, which is top down. But it's a reminder as you look to the various countries and their location and the sphere that the Arctic is, that if you're doing things by yourself as an Arctic nation, it's not only going to be lonely, it's going to be very difficult. And so what we are doing to expand communications capability is really a key ingredient to enhancing safety in the Arctic, and space technology plays a central role in that. I know you've heard from Tina Pigeon earlier from GCI talking about what they are doing in that sphere. You have Quintillion that is working to, again, open up avenues by way of fiber optic lines. But I think we recognize that all of this on land or undersea, this can't provide total coverage for us in the Arctic. It was last May, I had the opportunity to bring Secretary Zinke and some of my Senate colleagues to the Arctic. We were in Norway. We went to Thule Air Force Base in Greenland. And as we were flying from Thule to Alaska, we had an opportunity where a member of the flight crew showed us a map of global commercial communications satellite coverage. And we happened to be flying in one of these absolute dark spots. No coverage whatsoever. And it was just one of those very in-your-face reminders that when you are traveling in the Arctic, you bring your own rescue with you. There are many areas that we know that we have much to do. It's also a reminder that satellite coverage in the Arctic is going to be international in nature, and Alaska is certainly playing a part in that equation. Space technology essentially has 4 essential components: the satellite, the launch vehicle, the launch site, and the satellite downlink capability. NETI, you heard from earlier, probably talked about the great work that's being done at the Alaska Satellite Facility in Fairbanks. Alaska is also very proud to host the Pacific Spaceport Complex Alaska. This is state-owned, it's non-federal, it's a commercial entity located in Kodiak, but it offers the country's only high-latitude, full-service spaceport. It's the only U.S. facility that can launch high-inclination missions without the overflight of populated areas. And these are important assets. These are critical parts of the whole to not only better understand from a communications perspective, but to assist us with operations such as enforcement of fisheries, tracking illegal fishing, search and rescue activities, even volcano monitoring. So many different aspects that can come together as we understand more fully. I'm always talking about mapping. We're big on maps in a place where things are evolving and unfolding almost on a daily basis. It was only a couple years ago that we could say that we had better topographic maps of Mars and the Moon than we did of Alaska. But we've improved. We are truly coming into our own there, which is pretty important. It's kind of important that you actually have the mountains correctly located on the maps, particularly if you're up in the air and flying around. But we have better baseline data to track coastal erosion and a changing environment. So the mapping that has been underway for so long is so critical. We're looking forward to the launch of the second ice, cloud, and land elevation satellite, the ISAT-2, later this year, to provide even more precise altimetry measurements of sea ice and ice sheets. I think we know that there's been a pretty considerable gap since the initial ISATs completed its service in 2009. So we need to be filling in these blank spaces here. So with the good work of so many in this room, of so many that continue to lead in these spaces, we are advancing ahead in a strong way. So I'm pleased to be here with friends and new friends as we're talking about all that the Arctic holds for our future. And with that, Mike, I'm ready to sit down and have a conversation.
Okay. Well, let's have a conversation.
All right.
Eric will give a couple of thoughts, and then we'll start that conversation.
Okay.
Thank you, Lisa. It's remarkable how well you are going have summarized the discussion we had before you came. It's quite impressive, I think. So I try not to repeat things that has been said earlier, but a few people. I have been stressing that development of the Arctic should be on the foundation of the idea of enhancing the well-being of the people living in the Arctic, giving them better opportunities, creating better lives for them. And I have been focusing on in a modern world, digital infrastructure is essential a fundamental infrastructure for people, for businesses, and for other operators. And it has to be affordable and and you have to have it all the time. That's why when the parliamentarians of the Arctic regions gathers in Inari in the northern part of Finland this autumn, we will discuss the digital Arctic. It's a common initiative for all the 8 states, or the parliamentarians from the 8 states and the European Parliament, and trying to point out one direction or a direction for how to develop that. And that leads me to why I asked to have a few comments now, because after hearing today's discussions, I think it's 4 main questions, at least for me, I will take back and think more about. The first one is about the space industry. And when we are talking about other businesses in the Arctic, I always stresses that you have to have benefits for the people living in the north. And for the people belonging here to the space industry, that will be a major challenge. How will you give benefits for the people living in the north? Of course, we could discuss financial benefits, but I'm not so concerned by that. I'm much more concerned by how could people in the north, when you are using the opportunities in the north, give people in the north the possibility to work in the space industry. Because this is an important industry and you have to have opportunities then. I think Fairbanks is a good example. I think Tromsø is a good example. There are also a couple of Russian examples, I think. But how do we do that? And in the one discussion we also have to have is the big value of operating in the Arctic is the data you are gathering. And who owns the data? How do we in a modern world discuss taking part or having a fair share of that benefit in the north? Because it can't be just going to the north, taking out all the opportunities, let the people living there without some kind of benefits, but living with all the risks. The other question is utilizing space technology together with other techs. Unmanned aerial vehicles or systems, drones in a common language, is complementary, I think, to space technology. Vessels sailing in the maritime or maritime vessels are a part of it. And how do we, I think it was said earlier today, how do we puzzle this together so that we don't duplicate what's invested in? How do we get out the synergies from the different technologies that we have to figure out and use the right technology in the right area? The last question is about the actors. And I think there are 4 main actors in this field of interest or issues. It's the governments, of course. And all the Arctic countries have today a vision for the Arctic strategy that the Arctic should be a peaceful and stable region. But we see that there are more and more also government activities. And in a rougher international political climate, we also have a risk for spillover effects, which we have to take into account. Because I will name the military after hearing the discussion today. And I think, as an actor by themselves, both the Norwegian armed forces, the Russians are building capacities, the US is building capacities. This is totally legitimate, and we wish for it because we want to have authorities in this area. If not, it will be lawless. But how do we prevent the spillover effect and moving away from a stable and peaceful region? We have to discuss that. And how do we bring the military into also the synergies and cooperation about better solution for the Arctic? That will be hard in today's political climate, I think. Of course, the business What kind of requirements should we ask them for? How should they contribute into benefits, into cooperating with competitors, other parts in the world? Could we make a better climate for cooperation and synergies in the Arctic? And also academia, which are a big user but not have so much money. How could we bring them into the discussion also as a contributor to find better solutions? This is a part of the takeaway for me being here today. Thank you.
Thank you. So in the interest of time, maybe I'll just pose one question. It's a reposturing of a question that we had this morning, and then open it to the audience to pique some other discussions. One of the questions this morning was, how do we advance the collective agenda? Right? We have so many issues going on at once around this particular issue. Industry, governments, nonprofits, name them. So many people are in need of enhanced telecommunications, and so many companies and other assets are engaged in deploying telecommunications. And it seems like there needs to be some overarching strategy, and it's hard when you go beyond nation states to do that. It's hard even within our own countries to do that. But there are a number of organizations, the Arctic Council, the Arctic Economic Council, the parliamentarians. We can go down a list of all of those who show need and have an interest in what role do we collectively have, and because of your unique roles here, what role do you think lawmakers have from national perspectives in trying to figure out a way to thread those themes, or simply can that not happen? Simply dialogue like this is the best, other groups trying to advance the agenda is the best, or is there a way to provide some guidelines and some guardrails behind advancing for the better good all of these technologies to some end, and have all of us collectively help that? I can ask a smaller question, I guess.
No, I mean, it is the question of the day, I think, because there is a lot going on, but the problem is there's a lot going on, and it might be a smaller piece of it, and perhaps it is not as coordinated as it needs to be to gain that larger, that greater value. So how can you coordinate all this? I know that through the Arctic Council and through the Arctic Economic Council, they had the broadband conference. It was up in Utqiagvik. How long ago? It was a year ago? Maybe not even a year ago. But I think it's that type of a venue where you can really engage many different stakeholders. So it is not something that is led by one country, because I don't think that's the approach, and I don't think that it should be every man for themselves, because again, as I'm reminded every day that I look at the picture of my view of the world, if we do it every man for themselves, it's going to be expensive. It is going to be just lengthy in terms of time, and the networks won't be what we need them to be. It has to be international in scope. And so I think that the role that can be played of the AEC, of the Arctic Council, and us as Arctic parliamentarians, as Eric mentioned, for our conference coming up in September, one of the declaration policies relates to this issue of digitization. So I think you've got your systems in place. Maybe we just need to be a little more aggressive. During the previous administration, there was a great deal of attention that was focused from a council perspective on climate. And not to suggest that climate is not still very, very important, and we have to address that, but maybe we need to push out more to ensure that this aspect, this role of technologies and satellites and communications in a better connected Arctic moves to the top of the list.
Thank you. Eric?
Shortly, I agree with Lisa, as we also discussed earlier. And I think we have a history of getting results in the Arctic of doing it that way. Let me name three concrete examples of that. The first one is the Polar Code in the IMO, which was lifted into the UN system, the IMO, the International Maritime Organization. Important step forward, not as far as many wished for, but we got results. And in a UN perspective, it only took about 10 to 15 years. That's quite fast. Yeah, because here is a lot of nations having to agree. A lot of nations having to agree inside the international legal framework. This is a good result. Another example is the tourism actors on Svalbard.
Mm-hmm.
They have gone together. No, it's not just on Svalbard. It's an international discussion. They have developed guidelines for sustainable cruise tourism on their own, because they see that it's a fragile environment. You have to preserve what we are selling, which is the clean Arctic. So they have done that, sitting together around the table, developed a cooperation over years. This is a concrete example. And the last one is the Arctic Investment Protocol. It's a very good initiative. It was launched or presented in the Arctic Economic Forum, which is a part of the World Economic Forum in 2017. It's not a perfect instrument, but it's a start, which we can develop further. So it's possible to get these kind of initiatives by talking together. And if other industries have done it, also the space and the tech industry should be able to do the same.
Well, then I certainly just want to underscore my thanks to our colleagues at the Arctic Frontiers who have brought this issue to the Wilson Center. When we spoke last year about what issue could we help to advance, this was the one that we decided upon. And so I think we have some work before us to help advance that, and as partners with other partners to continue to do so. Let's take a couple of questions from the audience. I'm looking to my right.
Thank you. I just wanted to point out that one could host another workshop entitled Arctic Knowledge for a Smart and Resilient Space, because this works in both directions, right? Think, for instance, of the knowledge that's been transferred from the Norwegian offshore Arctic oil industry to the Norwegian space industry. Think of the knowledge that could be transferred from remote healthcare in the Arctic to remote healthcare to not just astronauts, but eventually colonists in space. And think also of the psychological knowledge with regards to people living in confined spaces, in small communities, in dark, cold, dangerous places. Small Arctic communities have a lot of problems, but we're also learning a great deal about how to deal with those. A colony on Mars is going to have similar problems because we will get populations born off of Earth. They won't be carefully selected astronauts. And we'll have to learn how to deal with the same kind of problems in space that you deal with in northern Alaska. So there's a knowledge transfer that can operate in both directions, and Arctic residents have a lot to add to the future of space because they are experts in many of these questions. Thank you.
Interesting.
I would love to have you take exactly what you have said and go out to every small village and inspire these young kids all around, because that was well said.
I think we have another project ahead of us. Another one to my right and then to my left. Yeah. And Paul will come over to you.
Hi, thank you for your insightful words. I'm a glaciologist and a polar scientist, and one of the most critical capacities for conducting science in the Arctic is access to cutting-edge data. In the U.S., NASA is a preeminent institution that provides that kind of services for us. This year was the first year in the cryospheric sciences branch for NASA that we did not have solicitations for studying the Arctic, and particularly it's salient for the forthcoming launch of ISAT-2. We don't have a solicitation to sequester scientists to utilize ISAT data for an asset that will be forthcoming. So I would hope that in the near future, in a challenging political environment, that there's a push for maintaining the level of funding to support our science, and also to extend the kind of solicitations that prompt scientists like me to reach out to my colleagues in other countries within the Arctic domain to carry out cooperative science.
Thank you.
Paul?
Yes, thank you. Paul Foose from Alaska. So, Mr. Sievertson, in your remarks, you said that the application of space technology in Norway will be toward economic development. And I think that's correct, because you can't have a healthy space technology industry without a healthy economy. So while we appreciate a lot of the new attention on the Arctic, there's also an aspect of it that's pretty disconcerting for us who live there. And this is the idea that we're going to selectively bias against economic development in the Arctic to try to solve the world's global climate issues. And that's a deep concern. And I'm just wondering how you might think that we could address that to keep from having that bias used against us in the Arctic.
Well, thank you for that question. I use a lot of my time traveling to different conferences and seminars saying that, well, the climate change or the global warming is hitting the Arctic first and hardest, maybe with the exception of a few islands in the Pacific Ocean. But it's not the 4 million people living in the Arctic who has created the global warming. That's the sum of the activities of the 7 billion people living on the planet. And it's not evenly distributed, but it's the sum of our human activities. And this is about perception. It's about being an ambassador and using every opportunity to tell that story. So I agree, and I will continue to do that. And I will ask everyone here also to participating in adjusting the perception of, or the idea that making the Arctic into a form of reservoir or park with no change, that will solve the climate change. It won't.
Mm-hmm. I would just add to what Eric has articulated so well, that if you were to do as you have suggested, or as others have suggested, that you just wall off Alaska or parts of Arctic and say, no development, no development. But then there is no adjustment throughout the rest of the world. You haven't done anything to help the Arctic. I believe that the challenge for us is how we continue to engage in a modern society in a way that allows for healthy families and healthy communities with an economy that is placed where people choose to live. The challenge of the day is how we are able to access those resources to give us that economy, to give us a means to stay warm or to keep our lights on, and do so in a way that is sustainable to that region. And so, perhaps more than anywhere, we need to be working towards the advancements of more microgrid technology, because your remote little village in northern Canada or in Alaska or elsewhere is probably never going to be connected to somebody else's energy grid, transportation grid. We are islanded in every sense of the word in the Arctic. And so challenge us to use the ingenuity, to use this knowledge, as was mentioned by the gentleman just a bit ago, that comes with living in an area that can be formidable. The innovation, the pioneering that's been going on by those who are native to these polar regions, the reason that they have lasted for centuries is because they are resilient and incredibly brilliant, in my view. So let's tap into that energy. But that's the challenge for us in the Arctic. And I think those in the Arctic are up to it.
I think they are as well. Well, I will leave it at that in the interest of time. I know that the Senator has other other matters to attend to. We've taken a lot of time this morning. Eric, thank you so much for participating on the panel and for your comments here. Senator, thank you for coming over from the Hill and making always time for us here at the Wilson Center, but more importantly for the Arctic and for your colleagues here. I want to thank Arctic Frontiers for their work with us. We look forward to a wonderful partnership with you. I think we have maybe too many things to attack, but we'll do them in a sequential manner. I want to thank the Embassy of Norway here in Washington, D.C. as well. And as always, thank all of you for coming to these programs. We think they're worthwhile, and when you come and participate, then we know that they are worthwhile. So thank you very much, and thank you to all of our colleagues today for a wonderful morning. Thank you.